All right, welcome back. We're just going to talk a little bit about what it says in the rest of the Constitution. We've addressed the preamble and the first three articles, but there's also Articles 4, 5, 6, and 7 to talk about. So let's just quickly mention those. Article 4 is about the states and how they interact with each other and the role of the federal government in dealing with the states. And mostly what Article 4 says is that the states have to respect each other's laws and public records. There are a few more details there, including the Fugitive Slave Clause, which is kind of a bummer. But mostly what you need to know is that Article 4 is all about the states agreeing to all abide by the same terms. Article 5 is about amending the Constitution. So let's talk about how that gets done. The Constitution can be amended in two different ways. The first way is that the Constitution can get an amendment, and that amendment can be passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress plus ratification by 3/4 of the states. So that's one way that can happen. The other way that that could happen is that a group of states could actually ask for a new constitutional convention. But if that happened and there was a new constitutional convention, what would happen is that that new constitution would once again have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So remember, this is different from the Articles of Confederation, which required initial ratification by all the states, resulting in Maryland withholding approval for 4 years until it was given the land it demanded as a condition of approving the Articles of Confederation. So what happens is the current way of amending the Constitution is much easier than the original way. And although the Constitution doesn't get amended very often, it is possible, and it's been amended several times. Article 6 pertains to foreign debts incurred prior to the writing of the Constitution, so it is not something that you need to know very much about. Article 7 talks about the process to adopt the Constitution, which you already know about. It also includes the signatures of all the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. And then the next section is the Bill of Rights, which we will talk about at another time. Okay, I'm now going to try to explain how a bill becomes a law. This is kind of an involved process, so bear with me. The first thing you need to know is that bills originate in either the House or the Senate, and a bill is just an idea for a law that's been written up but hasn't become law yet. In order to become a law, what's going to happen at the end is that both houses of Congress have to pass the same version of a bill, and the president has to sign it. The steps to get there are pretty involved, so let's check them out. First, the bill gets introduced in either the House or the Senate. Let's say it's introduced in the House for now, because we've got to pick one. Once the bill is introduced, it goes to the relevant committee. So that's a group of people who work on that kind of bill. So there might be a committee for bills having to do with energy policy, or a committee for bills having to do with military policy. Whatever the relevant committee is, they'll get the bill, and they will read it, mark it up, argue about it, and in theory, decide to put it to a committee vote. But before that even happens, the committee can vote to table the bill, which means that even though it doesn't get voted on, it just sort of disappears. The other thing that can happen is that the full committee could vote down the bill, which would also cause the bill to die. If that doesn't happen, the bill would go to a floor vote, at which the House of Representatives would get to argue about the bill in the full House, and people could still propose amendments or debate the bill. And what happens is, if it passes, then we can move on. However, before that can happen, there's another way that it can die, which is that obviously, first of all, the bill could be voted down in the House. But the other thing that could happen is that the Speaker of the House could refuse to put the bill up for debate at all. So, if the bill gets put into committee, voted on in committee, goes to a floor vote, and passes the floor vote, that's the point where things get really complicated. So let's imagine now that our bill has gotten through the House of Representatives. Well, the Senate also has to vote on the bill. So the Senate is going to take up what was originally the same bill, and they're going to put it through their own committee process. And their committee process works pretty much the same way, and the bill can die in pretty much all of the same ways. Once the bill gets to the Senate, there is a special thing that can happen to it to make it die, which is called a filibuster. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But one other thing I want to mention is that it's possible in all of this committee work and all of these floor debates, when people are offering amendments to the bill to change it and make it a little bit different, it's possible that somebody could put in what's called a poison pill amendment. A poison pill is when you amend a bill with some rule that makes it so unpalatable that nobody will vote for it. So if you amend a bill with a rule saying that, like, okay, we'll pass your tax plan, but every single school has to put an elephant on the roof and it always has to be there, well, that's a poison pill. Nobody's going to vote on that. That's insane. In addition, what happens next is that the Senate bill, which has, let's imagine, passed, and the House bill, which, let's imagine, has passed, now have to be reconciled. So they're going to go to a conference committee. And the conference committee is where people from the House and people from the Senate take their versions of the bill, which are probably a little different, and they try to come up with a compromise. So once again, this is a place where if they can't come up with a compromise, the bill dies. And here's the crazy part: if they can come up with a compromise, the new bill has to get all the way through the House and all the way through the Senate again before it can actually pass. But okay, let's imagine that that happens. At that point, the bill goes to the president, who has to sign the bill. But the president doesn't have to sign it. The president can decide to veto the bill, which means he's saying no. If that happens, the bill goes back to Congress and they can debate it and amend it even more, or they can try to override the veto, which in order to do that, they need a 2/3 majority in both houses, which is quite difficult to do. Bear in mind that all of these votes, in theory, require only a 50% plus one vote majority. So, the other thing the president can do, if the president doesn't want to sign the bill, is the president can take no action. The president can just pretend the bill never got to him. If the president does that, the bill automatically becomes law after 10 days, or if the Congress goes out of session within those 10 days, the president can have done what's called a pocket veto, and then the bill kind of vanishes and Congress has to go through all the motions again. So, as you can see, there's more ways for a bill not to become a law than there are for a bill to become a law. It's pretty difficult to make laws in this country, and that's by design. The founders did not want tyranny, so they made our government very slow. Speaking of making our government very slow, let's just do a quick review of the checks and balances system. So, you remember that the executive branch has the ability to check judicial power because the executive branch gets to appoint judges and fill vacancies. The president can also grant reprieves and pardons, so if somebody is being punished unfairly, the president can solve that problem through executive action. The president also checks the power of Congress because the president gets to enforce the laws, so no matter what laws get made, the president is in charge of how those laws get enforced. In addition, the executive can veto bills, recommend legislation, and call Congress into session if he or she wants to. The legislative branch can check the executive branch by overriding presidential vetoes, control appropriations, which means how much money the president has to work with, ratify treaties or not ratify treaties, declare war or refuse to declare war, refuse presidential appointments, or even impeach and remove the president from office, if that has to happen. The legislative branch also has a check on the judiciary because the legislative branch, specifically the Senate, can refuse judicial appointments. The legislative branch can impeach judges. The legislative branch can create lower courts. And the legislative branch can, if it needs to, propose constitutional amendments to overrule Supreme Court decisions that it really doesn't like. The judicial branch is the least powerful of the three branches, but still quite powerful. It can check the legislative branch by interpreting laws and declaring laws unconstitutional. The judicial branch also can rule that a presidential action or executive order is unconstitutional. In addition, the Chief Justice presides over impeachment trials, and judges appointed by the president serve for life, so they're very hard to remove unless they're impeached. So I want to quickly talk about a couple things that haven't been in this constitutional presentation because they're not in the Constitution, but if you think about politics in America, you almost invariably think about Democrats and Republicans. In other words, the political party system. And so I wanted to just mention what that is and how that fits into all this. Basically, the reason that one would have a system of political parties is that a political party is basically just a big group organized around a particular political agenda. And parties are actually quite useful in government because, first of all, they help organize government action. So if you have a Senate or a House that is composed of 52% Republicans and 48% Democrats, it's clear that the House of Representatives is going to be more Republican than Democratic, and therefore the Republicans are going to be able to get their agenda across, whereas if the House was more Democratic than Republican, the Democrats would be able to get more of their agenda across. And so it's useful to understand who's in power and what the balance of power is, and parties kind of help clarify that. In addition, parties as organizations help fund elections. It's very expensive to run for office, and it's complicated to make all the contacts you need in order to do that, especially since often the people running for president have to introduce themselves to huge numbers of people in all kinds of states they don't live in. So a political party can help somebody to do the job of running for office and to get their agenda out to the world at large, or at least to America at large. Finally, parties are useful because they help people, individual voters I mean, understand the political world. So if you're a registered Republican or a registered Democrat, that's going to be a way for you to clarify what your basic political positions are. That doesn't mean that you have to only vote for candidates from the party you happen to be affiliated with at the moment. People can change their minds. It's one of the wonderful things about being people. But sometimes having clear definitions for different sets of political agendas can really help clarify the conversation. Other times, though, it can really make people kind of frustrated. Let's take a look at that. So something that we really haven't talked about very much, but that comes up in American politics all the time, is called the filibuster. This is something that only exists in the US Senate, but it's pretty important. So basically, what a filibuster is a decision to keep a bill in debate infinitely until the Senate gives up and essentially lets the bill go without ever voting on it because it's been talked about for too long. A filibuster is a really good way of killing a bill. And what's particularly useful about the filibuster is that to break a filibuster, in other words, if somebody has decided to keep a bill in the debate stage infinitely, the only way to get that to stop is to get 60 votes for something called cloture. And cloture basically means debate is closed. So if you're the Democratic Party or the Republican Party and you're in the minority temporarily, the filibuster is a really useful trick because instead of having to get 51 votes to stop something you don't like from passing, all you have to do is prevent your opponent from getting 60 votes. Because if you could do that, they can never close debate. And that has led to a fair amount of what's called gridlock in the Senate, which means a lot of trouble passing bills that have a lot of partisan feelings on either side. And you can see from the graph that I'm showing you that over time, especially recently, there have been more and more filibusters as sort of political conflict has increased. Well, so what can be done about this? Well, some people think that what can be done about this filibuster problem is that the president can just run the country with a series of what's called executive orders. This is also something that's not in the Constitution. But the president does have the authority to decide how laws are going to be enforced, and executive orders are really just a way of the president telling people who work for him or her that this is how I would like the laws that exist to be enforced. So executive orders in a lot of ways function like laws. They can even be overturned as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And so what you would expect if Congress is not able to get things done is that there would be more and more executive orders because it would be more and more necessary to run the country without Congress because Congress just simply isn't able to pass things. But what's interesting is that's actually not the case. So if you look at this chart, what you see is that executive orders really peaked under Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s, who really, really, really liked executive orders. And nowadays, under presidents like George W. Bush and Barack Obama, even though whenever they issue an executive order, there might be a lot of political anger about it, really no president uses executive orders that frequently these days. All right, we'll finish up with a hypothetical, because maybe an example will help you understand all this. This has been pretty complicated. Let's imagine that the senator from North Carolina is supported by a significant voting bloc of pig farmers. The pig farmers believe they could increase their market share in the sale of pizza toppings if pepperoni were taken off the market. So they ask their senator to propose a bill banning pepperoni pizza so that American meat products are protected. The senator wants to accurately represent their interests in Washington, D.C., so she proposes a bill that would make it illegal to make, sell, or consume pepperoni pizza. So what would have to happen for that bill to become a law? Okay. Well, basically, in order for that to become a law, the bill proposed would have to go all the way through the Senate, because it's a senator who's interested in this, and the Senate would have to pass the bill by a simple majority, assuming it didn't get filibustered. So 51%. Once the bill passed the Senate, it would have to pass through the House, also with a simple majority of 51%. If the House version were different from the Senate version, a joint committee of representatives and senators would have to hash out language that was acceptable to both houses. That would be the thing that happens in the conference committee. The common version would then go back through both the House and the Senate, and if they both passed it with a simple majority, the bill would go to the president to sign. And the president would then be able to sign that bill into law, and if he didn't want to, or if she didn't want to, the president could veto the law, and then both houses of Congress would need a 2/3 majority to pass the bill and make pepperoni pizza illegal. All right. But come on, guys, we all know that pepperoni pizza is wonderful. So that wouldn't really work, because pepperoni importers would be furious that the ban on pepperoni pizza became law. They'd want to get the law changed. How could they do that? Well, there's a bunch of ways they could do it. Here's some of them. Number one, the legislative route. Basically, the pepperoni importers could convince Congress to pass another bill repealing the pepperoni pizza law. The president would then have to sign that bill into law in exactly the way we just sort of described. The other way they could do it is the judicial route. So they could bring a lawsuit arguing that their constitutional rights had been violated by this law. If that happened, the Supreme Court would hear arguments, try to figure out exactly where in the Constitution pepperoni pizza is protected, and if it found that in fact their rights had been violated, they would strike down the law, and the pepperoni pizza law would go the way of the dodo. There is, of course, a third way that the pepperoni importers could deal with this problem, which is the most awesome way and also the most unlikely, which is that they could propose a constitutional amendment permanently protecting the right of all citizens to eat pepperoni pizza. If they did that, it would have to be passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then ratified by 3/4 of the states. It seems to me extremely unlikely that that would happen, but it would also be my favorite thing ever if it did. All right, that's all 3 parts of this U.S. government mini survey. Thank you so much for listening to all of this. I had fun making it. Bye-bye.